Okie dokie. Hello, folks. We seem to be having an issue with the audio. I shall have a quick check and see if we can get this going. Right. Sorry, folks. Do we have audio now? Hold on 1 second, folks. Sorry. Okay. Right. Amber, can you hear me right now? Thumbs up is all I need. Yes, excellent. So people can hear me right now.
Hello, my name is Amber
Are we
Rivers.
getting audio?
I'm a third-year PhD student at University of the Highlands and Islands. And today I'll be talking about my research on textile production at the cairns, an Iron Age Broch and extramural settlement on South Ronaldsay, Orkney. This study sought to determine the nature of textile production at the site by utilizing a dual approach, combining a distribution analysis of unearthed textile tools, in this case spindle whorls used to twist wool into yarn, with experimental archaeology. The examination of spindle whorl distribution indicated that textile production intensified during the late 3rd through 4th centuries AD and began to be more highly organized. Using an established methodology which correlates spindle whorl weight with yarn gauge, experimental spinning trials were conducted with replicas of whorls recovered from the cairns to determine whether these production changes were the results of a change in products. Unfortunately, this study found this methodology to be unreliable in determining yarn gauge solely from whorl weight. This led to an exploration of the impact of tools versus human agency in textile practice and the need to refine existing methodologies. In her 1999 publication, Kathy Costin details how distribution analysis of craft tools in archaeological contexts can allow researchers to determine the existence of prehistoric craft specialization. She proposes that the degree of craft specialization may be determined by 4 factors: scale, which is product output, concentration, which pertains to how the laborers are organized, context, the social and political environment in which the craft production occurs, and finally, intensity, the amount of time devoted to production. On the left are Costin's categories arranged from least specialized, the individual output mode, to most specialized, retainer workshop. First, we'll consider the question of production scale. The table on the right details the distribution and characteristics of the 21 spindle whorls recovered at the cairns. Upon initial examination, it seems that the tools were spread fairly indiscriminately across the site. And the small sample size would lead one to conclude that only individual non-specialist production was occurring. However, closer examination revealed a larger concentration of whorls in two areas, structure F and building complex B, which consists of two joined structures. This suggests production may have been centered in these areas. Additionally, there was a significant increase in the number of whorls in occupation phase 6, the mid-3rd through 4th centuries AD, which was 4 times the amount attributed to the preceding phase, the late 1st through early 3rd centuries AD. This indicates an increased product output and could be indicative of surplus production. Next, we'll look at labor concentration. As already mentioned, while there was a larger concentration of whorls in structures F and building complex B, which could be evidence of a workshop, examination of tool morphology at the cairns did not provide clear evidence of standardization to indicate that production was overseen and highly controlled by a patron or state. The vast majority of whorls were manufactured from local sandstone, which is likely due to the wide availability of this material. But whorls made of atypical materials like whalebone and tooth and imported stone were also present. These tools exhibited a wide range of shapes and weights as well. And while most whorls were plain, there are 2 decorated examples. SF863 displayed carved concentric rings on its anterior and posterior surfaces, while SF2617 appeared to have been deliberately heat treated prior to perforation to achieve a bright red hue. On the right, you can see several of the whorls found at the cairns from above, including the carved specimen just mentioned, while the central image provides a side view of the common spindle whorl shapes. These differences in tool morphology indicate that production was not highly controlled in a formalized workshop and was most likely organized by the spinners themselves in a dispersed workshop or community output mode. Next, we must consider this increase in textile production at the cairns within the wider context of North Atlantic Iron Age Scotland. In a 2003 publication, Neil Sharples noted that these centuries toward the end of the Middle Iron Age marked a significant change in material culture across northern Scotland. Prior to this period, identity and status was primarily reflected in monumental architecture, notably Brochs, while material culture, with the exception of pottery, was relatively plain and functional. During the 3rd through 4th centuries AD, construction and use of these monumental buildings began to wane, while there was a rise in the number of portable personal adornment objects, such as bracelets and brooches, with a notable increase in imported prestige goods, such as these Roman glass beads found at the cairns. It seems logical that clothing would also have played a role in this new means of displaying identity. And if we compare the cairns textile tool assemblage to other sites in the region, such as Howe, we see a similar trend in intensification of textile manufacture alongside an increase in other adornment objects. We have rare examples of surviving fabric in Scotland from this period, which indicate textile craft workers were skilled in creating intricate cloth using various colors and patterns. On the left is a reproduction of a diamond twill fabric using 2 shades of naturally colored wool. Evidence suggests that the so-called improved breeds with pure white wool, introduced by the Romans to Britain, didn't make their way into Scotland until much later. So they primarily relied on the natural wool colors, black, morit, and brown, to add visual interest to their fabric. We do have some evidence of plant-dyed cloth from Iron Age Scotland, such as the Falkirk tartan, woven of yellow and brown checks. Another way of introducing patterning without colorants, called shadow patterning, could be achieved simply by varying the twist direction of the warp and weft threads so that they caught the light differently. The central photo shows the difference between S-spun, or left twisted yarn, and Z-spun, or right twisted yarn. On the right is a photo of the Orkney hood, an astonishingly well-preserved garment found in a peat bog and constructed of 2 recycled woven twill fabrics decorated with tablet woven bands. Items like these would have been woven on a warp-weighted loom, which relied on stone loom weights to provide tension to the fabric. These more complex fabrics would have required many hours and great skill to produce, as Jackie Wood learned in a 2003 study when she used experimental archaeology to recreate the Orkney hood. She noted that a greater time investment was necessary not only for weaving more complex patterns, but also for spinning the finer threads in these types of garments versus the coarse yarn used in everyday wear. So when we consider world distribution at the cairns in the context of the wider social changes throughout the region, it seems likely that this uptick in production was related to the manufacture of complex prestige fabrics for gifting and trade. Since we haven't yet found any surviving cloth from the cairns, the study sought to prove this hypothesis by employing experimental techniques to determine what types of fabric the cairns tools could have produced. It is commonly accepted amongst scholars that the weight of a spindle whorl will influence the diameter of the thread it will produce, lighter whorls spinning finer yarns and heavier whorls thicker yarns. These assumptions are supported by experimental trials conducted in 2006 by a team at the Center for Textile Research in Copenhagen, with incremental differences in whorl weight of as little as 5 grams having an impact on yarn gauge. Experiments with replicas of whorls from archaeological contexts in Viking Age Scandinavia and Iron Age Thrace have been used to determine the types of textiles produced at those sites. So this study implemented the same method. An experimental trial was designed using replicas of 3 whorls found at the cairns, representing different shapes, weights, and material compositions. 2 spinners of varying levels of experience participated in the study to account for differences in skill level on thread gauge. Both spinners worked with uncombed, untreated Shetland wool, as this breed has wool quality similar to those of native Iron Age sheep, a coarser outer hair and a fine downy undercoat. Each whorl produced a large range of thread gauges as detailed in the table below. You'll notice that though there is a huge difference in weight between the whorls, there is overlap in the thickness of thread they produced. The 2 photos show the extremes in thread gauge achieved with the same whorl. The lightest whorl, SF740, contrary to expectations, actually produced the thickest yarn. So while I was unfortunately unable to definitively prove from the tool morphologies that textile workers at the cairns specialized in finely woven fabrics during the latter part of the Middle Iron Age, this unexpected result led to bigger questions. If whorl weight doesn't determine thread gauge, then what does? In a 2015 study utilizing a larger number of artifacts and spinners than was possible within the bounds of this study, Kania had participants work with identical prehistoric whorl replicas and a selection of fiber types, and asked them to spin in whatever manner felt most right to them. She found that the spinners produced a huge range of thread characteristics, and in watching their movements, noted how they interacted differently with each fiber, adjusting their technique accordingly. For example, fibers with longer staples, the individual filaments that make up the fiber, don't require as much twist to produce a stable thread, So spinning with short stapled fibers like wool required different motions on the part of the spinners to impart enough twist to the fiber. She concluded that there is no one factor which determines the product. Spinning is a complex process in which tools, materials, and spinner interact. Many factors in addition to whorl morphology, fiber type and quality, the way the fiber was drafted, and most difficult of all to quantify, the individual spinner's skills, craft background, and intent influence the yarn produced. So how can we approach the study of prehistoric textile production? On the one hand, you have archaeologists, who more often than not don't practice textile production themselves. They are skilled at characterizing tools and understanding their depositional contexts and designing rigorous scientific experiments to test their function. However, these methods, as this study shows, are not infallible. Archaeologists have tended to treat textile production as a formula. If they achieve a specific result from a specific test, they apply it broadly. Whorl A plus fiber B always equals yarn C. But without that background in creative practice, they don't fully understand the role of the individual spinner's skill, background, and agency in producing a wide range of products using identical tools and materials. On the other hand, we have creative practitioners who have a clearer understanding of the variation in production that's possible. Much of their practice, however, is tacit, embedded in body and hands, which makes it difficult to articulate, especially to those not familiar with the craft. This knowledge has been passed down, and techniques will differ depending on which culture of craft they belong to. This makes practitioners prone to unintentional and perhaps even unaware biases, which might impact their interpretations of past practices. If they practice a craft with a long documented tradition, it is easy for them to assume that their techniques have always been used or that their methods are best practice. Going forward, a dual approach, a checks and balances system, if you will, which relies on both academic and creative knowledge and experience, is the best way to ensure accurate interpretation of archaeological textile production. So if the different sizes, shapes, and weights of whorls at the cairns weren't related to spinning different types of yarn, what were they for? I think it likely that with such a variable activity, tool variety might reflect the preference of individual spinners. In 2003, Christensen examined the effect of the ratio between whorl diameter and height on the speed and duration of the spindle's rotation. Those with a higher ratio will rotate more slowly but maintain velocity for longer, whereas those with a lower ratio will spin more quickly but will require more intervention on the part of the spinner to maintain this velocity. So less experienced spinners might feel more comfortable using whorls with a higher ratio, so they can focus on drafting the fiber without having to spin the whorl as frequently. Whereas experienced spinners might have the skill to split their focus. It is also worth exploring how common conditions like arthritis might have affected spinners, and whether certain whorl shapes or weights might have been easier to use. But functionality might not have been the sole reason for these morphological differences. Recent research has begun to consider crafting not just as a technical process, but a social process as well, where materials, tools, the crafter, their surroundings, and the finished object are imbued with meaning that is culture specific. The morphological and decorative differences in tools could be a way of marking them as the property of specific artisans within a community. Perhaps the decorative items belonging to more skilled spinners, or maybe linking them to a specific group. When we look at spindle whorls and other textile tools from this period, such as weaving combs, we begin to notice regional decorative motifs. These tools go beyond their function, taking on as much value and meaning as the fabrics they create. In conclusion, this study sought to link an identified change in the organization of textile production at the cairns during the mid-3rd through 4th centuries AD with the making of finer cloth for gifting or exchange using experimental archaeology. This trial was inconclusive in that respect, but it did open up other doors of inquiry. This and other studies suggest that it may be necessary to reevaluate existing methodologies and shift our thinking from tool-centered to a more holistic approach. The characteristics of the whorl and the type of fiber being spun do play a role in the resulting product, but the human factor plays a far greater role in yarn quality than has been previously credited. The spinner's technique and results will vary widely depending on their skill level and culture of practice. Going forward, experiments must be designed in such a way that this human factor can be given its proper due. It will never be possible to fully replicate the techniques used in the past, as production preferences within a given cultural region are not static, and methods of present-day practitioners may vary widely from those of prehistoric peoples. However, by employing practitioners with diverse skills and traditions, and using a variety of tools and fiber types in future experiments, one can more closely approximate the range of textiles produced at individual sites. And just as importantly as asking ourselves what artisans of the past were making and how, we must consider the social meaning ascribed to maker, tools, process, and product. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions.
Right. Right. Excellent. We now have a couple of pages of Amber's extensive referencing. And there we go. Right. I shall stop sharing now and we can get started with questions. Let's have a quick look. Excellent. So are there any questions that have come up in the chat? No. So if anybody has any questions, I think we might be stopping the recording now. So if anybody has any questions and would like to ask over here, whether you talk or you add that into the chat, feel free, and we can pass those questions on to Amber, who I am sure will have extensive answers for you.